In the autumn of 1845, deep within the rolling farmlands of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, a discovery was made that would forever change our understanding of human nature. The Grayson farm, known throughout the region as a safe haven for desperate immigrant families, harbored a secret that would shock even the most experienced investigators. For over a decade, Grayson had built an impeccable reputation as a charitable man who helped newcomers from Ireland and Germany. 22 complete families, 89 souls in total, sought out his farm over the years, drawn by promises of work and shelter. But something was terribly wrong. Families would arrive at the Grayson property and simply vanish. The Lancaster County Sheriff's report, sealed for over 80 years due to its disturbing content, described scenes so macabre that 2 investigating officers suffered complete mental breakdowns. What made this discovery truly haunting was the chilling realization that Ezekiel Grayson had been operating his twisted hospitality for over a decade, luring desperate immigrant families only to trap them in a nightmare from which there was no escape. Before we dive into the terrifying truth behind the Grayson homestead, I want to ask you something important. This channel explores the darkest corners of American history, stories that most people are too afraid to confront. If you're still here, you're not like everyone else. You understand that some truths, no matter how disturbing, must be told. Hit that subscribe button and join our community of fearless truth seekers. And tell me in the comments, what state are you watching from? Are you brave enough to hear what really happened in your own backyard? The Pennsylvania of 1845 was a land of promise and opportunity. At least for those who had been born within its borders, the great waves of Irish and German immigration had begun flooding American ports, bringing with them families desperate to escape poverty, famine, and political persecution in their homelands. Lancaster County, with its fertile soil and established farming communities, represented the American dream that had drawn these families across the treacherous Atlantic Ocean. Ezekiel Grayson's farm sat on 340 acres of prime agricultural land along Conesaga Creek, about 12 mi southeast of the bustling town of Lancaster. To any traveler passing along the well-worn road that connected the smaller farming communities to the county seat, the Grayson homestead appeared to be the very picture of American prosperity and industry. The main farmhouse, built in the sturdy German style common to the region, featured thick stone walls, small windows, and a steep pitched roof designed to shed the heavy Pennsylvania snows. The property included all the buildings typical of a successful farming operation: a massive red barn that dominated the landscape, a smaller dairy barn, a smokehouse, chicken coops, and various storage buildings scattered across the immediate farmyard. Fields of corn, wheat, and barley stretched toward the horizon, while pastures dotted with cattle and sheep completed the pastoral scene. To the casual observer, everything about the Grayson farm suggested hard work, prosperity, and the kind of solid American values that the community respected and admired. Ezekiel Grayson himself appeared to embody these same virtues. A man of 52 in 1845, he stood just over 6 feet tall with the broad shoulders and calloused hands of someone who had spent his life working the land. His brown hair was beginning to show streaks of gray, and his weathered face bore the lines that came from decades of exposure to sun and wind. He dressed simply but well, favoring the practical clothing of a working farmer: sturdy wool trousers, cotton shirts, and leather boots that were always clean despite the demands of farm work. What set Grayson apart from his neighbors, and what would later prove to be the key to his horrific success, was his reputation for charitable work among the immigrant community. Unlike many established Americans who viewed the flood of foreign newcomers with suspicion or outright hostility, Ezekiel Grayson presented himself as a friend to those seeking a new life in America. He spoke passable German, having learned it from his own grandfather, who had immigrated to Pennsylvania in the 1780s, and he had picked up enough Irish Gaelic from workers he had employed over the years to communicate with Irish families. Grayson's charitable reputation had begun in the early 1830s, when he had genuinely helped several German families establish themselves in the area. He had provided temporary housing, helped them find permanent land to purchase, and even loaned money for equipment and livestock. These early acts of kindness had been legitimate, motivated by a combination of Christian charity and practical business sense. Immigrant families who succeeded in the area became customers for his grain and livestock. The transformation from genuine charity to systematic murder had been gradual, so subtle that even Grayson himself might not have been able to identify the exact moment when helping immigrants became exploiting them, and exploiting them became killing them. The change seemed to have begun around 1834, when a particularly harsh winter had left Grayson with significant financial losses. Cattle had died, crops had failed, and debts had mounted to the point where the farm's survival was in question. It was during this period of financial stress that Grayson had begun to notice how completely vulnerable the immigrant families were. They arrived with no connections to the established community, no knowledge of American laws or customs, and often no ability to communicate effectively in English. Most importantly, they carried with them whatever money they had managed to save for their journey to America, sometimes substantial sums that represented the life savings of entire extended families. The first family to disappear from the Grayson farm had been the Kellys, an Irish family of 7 who had arrived in Lancaster County in the spring of 1835. Patrick Kelly, his wife Bridge, and their 5 children had been traveling from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, where Patrick's brother was supposed to have found work in the steel mills. They had stopped at the Grayson farm, seeking directions and a place to rest for the night, and Ezekiel had welcomed them with the warmth and hospitality that had made him famous throughout the immigrant community. According to Grayson's later account to neighbors, the Kelly family had decided to continue their journey early the next morning before dawn in order to make good time on the road to Pittsburgh. He had provided them with food for their journey and directions to the best route west. When Patrick Kelly's brother in Pittsburgh eventually wrote to authorities asking about the family's whereabouts, the inquiry eventually reached Lancaster County. But by then the trail was cold, and the assumption was that the family had either changed their plans or met with some misfortune on the dangerous roads between Pennsylvania towns. The Kelly family's disappearance had established a pattern that Grayson would follow for the next decade. Immigrant families would arrive at his farm, usually in the evening when they were tired and vulnerable. He would offer them hospitality, food, and shelter for the night. The families would be grateful for his kindness, especially since many other Americans they had encountered had been hostile or suspicious. They would share their stories, their plans, and most importantly, they would reveal how much money they carried and where they were planning to settle. Then, sometime during the night or early morning, the families would simply vanish. Grayson would explain to anyone who asked that they had decided to continue their journey early, that they had been eager to reach their destination, or that they had received word that required them to change their plans. Since immigrant families were constantly on the move, and communication was difficult, these explanations were readily accepted by the community. What made Grayson's operation particularly insidious was how he had cultivated relationships with legitimate immigrant aid organizations and religious groups. He regularly attended meetings of the Lancaster County Immigrant Assistance Society, where he would volunteer to help newly arrived families find temporary housing and employment. He donated money to churches that provided services to immigrants. And he even served on a committee that was supposed to investigate reports of immigrants being cheated or mistreated by unscrupulous Americans. This involvement in legitimate charitable work provided Grayson with a steady stream of potential victims while simultaneously establishing his reputation as someone who could be trusted. Immigrant families were often directed to his farm by well-meaning church leaders and aid workers who had no idea they were sending these vulnerable people to their deaths. The very organizations that were supposed to protect immigrants had become unwitting accomplices in their destruction. Dr. Heinrich Müller, a German immigrant who had successfully established a medical practice in Lancaster and who worked closely with immigrant aid organizations, later recalled recommending the Grayson farm to dozens of families over the years. Ezekiel was known as a man who understood the struggles of our people. Dr. Mueller would testify years later. He spoke our language, he knew our customs, and he seemed genuinely committed to helping families establish themselves in America. I sent families to him because I believed he was one of the few Americans who truly cared about our welfare. Reverend Michael O'Brien, who served the growing Irish Catholic community in Lancaster County, had similar memories of Grayson. He would come to our church services occasionally, always respectful, always willing to help. When families needed temporary shelter or advice about finding work, Ezekiel Grayson's name was always mentioned as someone who could be trusted. He seemed to understand that these families had left everything behind and needed the kindness of strangers to survive in their new country. What none of these well-meaning community leaders realized was that Grayson had been carefully studying the immigrant community, learning their patterns, their vulnerabilities, and their needs. He had identified the perfect victims. Families who were traveling alone, who had no established connections in America, who carried significant amounts of money, and who could disappear without anyone immediately noticing their absence. The physical setup of the Grayson farm was perfectly suited to his criminal enterprise. The property was isolated enough that screams wouldn't be heard by neighbors, but not so remote as to seem suspicious. The large barn provided ample space for concealing evidence, while the various outbuildings offered multiple locations for hiding bodies or storing belongings. Most importantly, the farm's legitimate operations provided cover for any unusual activities. The sounds of construction, the movement of materials, and the presence of workers could all be explained as normal farming activities. Grayson had also been careful to maintain his reputation in the established American community. He paid his debts promptly, attended church regularly, and participated in community activities. He served on the school board, contributed to local charities, and was known as a reliable neighbor who could be counted on to help during emergencies. This solid reputation made it virtually impossible for anyone to suspect that he was capable of the systematic murder of entire families. The deception was so complete that even Grayson's own hired workers had no idea what was happening on the farm. He employed several local men for seasonal work, and they remembered him as a fair employer who paid decent wages and provided good working conditions. The areas of the farm where the murders took place were off-limits to these workers, explained as storage areas for valuable equipment or dangerous materials that required special handling. As 1845 progressed, Ezekiel Grayson appeared to be at the height of his success and respectability. His farm was prosperous, his reputation in the community was solid, and his work with immigrant families was widely praised. What no one realized was that beneath this facade of American virtue lay one of the most systematic and horrific criminal enterprises in the nation's history. An operation that had already claimed the lives of dozens of innocent families and showed no signs of slowing down. The first hints that something might be amiss at the Grayson homestead came from sources that seemed entirely unrelated to each other. Scattered observations that individually meant nothing, but together began to form a disturbing pattern. Like pieces of a puzzle that no one realized they were assembling, these small anomalies would eventually reveal the horrific truth that lay hidden beneath Ezekiel Grayson's carefully constructed facade of respectability and charity. Martha Zimmerman, who operated a small general store in the village of Strasburg, about 5 miles from the Grayson farm, was among the first to notice something unusual about Ezekiel's purchasing patterns. Mrs. Zimmerman had been serving the farming community for over 20 years, and she prided herself on knowing the needs and habits of her regular customers. Farmers were creatures of routine, she had learned, and their purchases followed predictable patterns based on the seasons, the size of their families, and the scope of their operations. Ezekiel Grayson had always been a good customer, purchasing supplies regularly and paying promptly in cash. But beginning around 1836, Mrs. Zimmerman noticed that his orders had begun to include items that seemed odd for a bachelor farmer. He was buying large quantities of children's clothing, women's shoes, and personal items like combs, mirrors, and hair ribbons. When she had asked about these purchases, Grayson had explained that he was collecting donations for immigrant families, who often arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The explanation had seemed reasonable at the time, consistent with Grayson's known charitable work. But as the years passed, Mrs. Zimmerman began to wonder why he needed such large quantities of these items on such a regular basis. It seemed like every month he was buying enough clothing to outfit several families, she would later recall. I began to wonder how many immigrant families could possibly be passing through Lancaster County, and why they all seemed to need help from Ezekiel Grayson. Even more puzzling were Grayson's purchases of medical supplies and chemicals. He regularly bought large quantities of laudanum, a powerful opium-based painkiller that was commonly used for serious injuries and illnesses. He also purchased unusual amounts of lime, which had legitimate uses on farms, but was also known to be effective at controlling odor and accelerating decomposition. When Mrs. Zimmerman had asked about these purchases, Grayson had explained that he was treating sick animals and improving his soil, but the quantity seemed excessive even for a large farming operation. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, who served as the traveling physician for the rural areas around Lancaster County, had his own concerns about the Grayson farm. Over the years, he had been called to the property on several occasions to treat what Grayson described as injured or ill immigrant workers. However, Dr. Hartwell had never actually been allowed to examine any patients directly. Instead, Grayson would meet him at the edge of the property, describe symptoms in detail, and request specific medications. Ezekiel seemed to have an unusual knowledge of medical conditions. Dr. Hartwell later testified he could describe symptoms with the precision of someone who had medical training, and he always knew exactly what medications he wanted. When I insisted on examining the patients myself, he would explain that they were too frightened of strangers or too ill to be moved, or that they had cultural objections to being treated by unfamiliar doctors. The doctor had found these explanations plausible at first, knowing that many immigrants were indeed suspicious of American medical practices and preferred to be treated by people they trusted. But as the requests continued year after year, always following the same pattern, Dr. Hartwell began to suspect that something was not quite right. It occurred to me that in all my years of treating immigrant families, I had never encountered such consistent reluctance to allow medical examination. Most people, regardless of their background, were grateful for professional medical care when they were seriously ill. Father Johannes Brennan, who served the German Catholic community in Lancaster County, had noticed a different kind of pattern that troubled him deeply. Over the years, he had received dozens of letters from relatives in Germany asking about families who had supposedly settled in the Lancaster area, but had never written home. The letters described families who had left Germany with specific plans to contact Father Brennan's church. Families who had carried letters of introduction and had intended to become part of the German Catholic community. These were not people who would simply disappear, Father Brennan explained years later. They were devout families who understood the importance of maintaining connections with their relatives back home. They had promised to write. They had planned to send money. And they had intended to help other family members immigrate to America. It was completely out of character for so many families to simply vanish without any communication. When Father Brennan had made inquiries about these missing families, he was often told that they had been helped by Ezekiel Grayson, but had decided to move on to other parts of Pennsylvania or to other states entirely. The explanations were always reasonable. Better opportunities elsewhere, relatives who had been found in other locations, or simply the restless nature of immigrant families who were still searching for the perfect place to settle. But the sheer number of families who seemed to have passed through the Grayson farm and then disappeared began to trouble the priest. I began to keep records, he later testified. Over a 10-year period, I received inquiries about 47 families who had supposedly been helped by Ezekiel Grayson. 47 families who had simply vanished without a trace, even accounting for poor communication and the mobility of immigrant populations. This seemed like an extraordinary number. Thomas McKenna, an Irish immigrant who had successfully established himself as a blacksmith in Lancaster, had his own disturbing observations about the Grayson farm. McKenna had been one of the early immigrants who had genuinely been helped by Grayson, and he maintained a relationship with the farmer that included occasional visits to discuss community affairs and immigrant assistance work. During these visits, McKenna had noticed several things that seemed odd. The Grayson farm always seemed to have fresh graves scattered around the property, which Ezekiel explained as burial sites for livestock that had died of disease. But McKenna, who had grown up on a farm in Ireland, knew that farmers typically buried dead animals in remote areas of their property, not in multiple locations around the main farmyard. There were always new mounds of earth somewhere on the property, McKenna later recalled. Ezekiel would explain that he had lost a cow to disease or that a horse had broken a leg, but it seemed like his animals died with unusual frequency, and the graves were always in different locations, as if he was trying to spread them around the property rather than using a single burial ground. McKenna had also noticed that the Grayson farm seemed to accumulate personal belongings that didn't match Ezekiel's simple lifestyle. During visits to the farmhouse, he had glimpsed women's clothing hanging in back rooms, children's toys scattered in corners, and personal items like jewelry and religious artifacts that seemed inconsistent with a bachelor farmer's possessions. When he had asked about these items, Grayson had explained that they were donations he was collecting for immigrant families, but McKenna wondered why he kept such large quantities of personal belongings on hand. The most disturbing observation came from McKenna's young son, Patrick, who had accompanied his father on several visits to the Grayson farm. Children, McKenna knew, often noticed things that adults missed, and Patrick had made several comments that troubled his father deeply. The boy said he could hear crying coming from the big barn. McKenna later testified, not the crying of animals but human crying like children or women in distress. When I asked Ezekiel about it, he said that immigrant families sometimes stayed in the barn temporarily and that they were often emotional about their circumstances. The explanation seemed reasonable, but Patrick insisted that the crying sounded different, more frightened than sad. Young Patrick had also mentioned seeing faces in the windows of the barn, faces that appeared briefly and then disappeared, as if the people inside were trying to hide. When McKenna had asked Grayson about this, the farmer had explained that immigrant families were often shy and frightened of strangers, preferring to stay out of sight until they felt more comfortable in their new surroundings. Jacob Stoltzfus, an Amish farmer whose property bordered the Grayson homestead, had made observations that added another disturbing element to the growing pattern of anomalies. The Amish community was known for its careful attention to the natural world and its rhythms, and Stoltz had noticed that the wildlife patterns around the Grayson farm were unusual. The scavenger birds were always circling over his property. Stoltz later testified through a translator, as he spoke only Pennsylvania Dutch. Crows, vultures, ravens, they were constantly present in numbers that seemed excessive for normal farm operations. When animals die naturally on a farm, the scavengers come and go quickly, but at the Grayson place, they seemed to be permanent residents. Stoutzers had also noticed that his own livestock became agitated when the wind blew from the direction of the Grayson farm. Horses would become nervous. Cattle would refuse to graze in pastures adjacent to the Grayson property, and even the farm dogs would whine and pace when certain odor drifted across the boundary between the properties. Animals know things that people don't always notice, Stoltzfus explained. They can smell death, they can sense danger, and they react to things that humans might ignore. My animals were telling me that something was wrong at the Grayson farm, but I didn't understand what they were trying to communicate. The most significant early warning sign came from an unexpected source, the United States Postal Service. Postmaster William Harrison, who supervised mail delivery for the Lancaster County area, had begun to notice an unusual pattern in the mail that was addressed to the Grayson farm. Large numbers of letters arrived regularly from Germany and Ireland. Letters that were addressed to families who were supposedly staying temporarily at the Grayson property. However, Harrison noticed that while many letters arrived for these families, very few letters were ever sent from the Grayson farm to addresses in Europe. This seemed odd since immigrant families were typically eager to maintain contact with relatives back home, especially during their first years in America when they were still establishing themselves, and often needed to send for other family members. It was like mail was flowing in one direction only, Harrison later explained. Families in Europe were writing to their relatives at the Grayson farm, but those relatives never seemed to write back. I began to wonder if the families were actually receiving their mail, or if something was preventing them from responding to their loved ones back home. When Harrison had mentioned this observation to Grayson during one of his regular mail deliveries, the farmer had explained that many of the immigrant families were illiterate and relied on him to help them with correspondence. He claimed that he was often too busy with farm work to assist with letter writing, and that many families preferred to wait until they were permanently settled before resuming regular communication with relatives in Europe. The explanation had seemed plausible, but Harrison continued to be troubled by the sheer volume of undelivered or unanswered mail. I had been delivering mail for over 15 years, he later testified, and I had never seen such a consistent pattern of one-way correspondence. Even illiterate families usually found ways to send some kind of communication back to their relatives, even if it was just a brief note written by someone else. As 1845 progressed, these various observations and concerns began to coalesce into a growing sense of unease among some members of the Lancaster County community. Individual anomalies that had seemed explainable in isolation began to form a pattern that was harder to dismiss. The excessive purchases of personal items, the medical requests without patient examinations, the missing families, the unusual animal behavior, the one-way mail flow. Taken together, these observations suggested that something was seriously wrong at the Grayson homestead. However, the power of Ezekiel Grayson's reputation and the community's respect for his charitable work continued to provide protection against serious scrutiny. Most people who noticed unusual aspects of his operation were willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, assuming that there were reasonable explanations for anything that seemed odd. The idea that a respected member of the community could be involved in systematic murder was simply too horrific for most people to consider. Seriously, before we continue with this chilling investigation, I need to ask you something. Are you finding these dark secrets as disturbing as I am? If this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, make sure you're subscribed to our channel so you never miss these incredible true crime stories. Hit that subscribe button now, and let's continue uncovering the horrifying truth together. The stage was set for a discovery that would shatter the community's faith in appearances and reveal that the most monstrous evil could hide behind the most respectable facade. The signs had been there for years, scattered like breadcrumbs along a trail that led directly to one of the most horrific crime scenes in American history. But it would take a chance encounter and the courage of an unexpected witness to finally expose the truth about what was really happening at the Grayson homestead. The discovery that would finally expose Ezekiel Grayson's horrific enterprise began with a series of seemingly unrelated events in the late summer of 1845. A severe drought had gripped Lancaster County for most of July and August, causing wells to run dry and forcing farmers to seek alternative water sources for their livestock and crops. It was this desperate search for water that would lead to the first concrete evidence of the systematic murder that had been taking place at the Grayson homestead for over a decade. On August 23, 1845, a young German immigrant named Klaus Weber was traveling through Lancaster County with his pregnant wife Anna and their 2 small children. The Weber family had landed in Philadelphia 3 weeks earlier and were making their way to Ohio, where Klaus's brother had supposedly found work and land that could be purchased cheaply. Like so many immigrant families before them, they had heard of Ezekiel Grayson's reputation for helping newcomers, and they had specifically sought out his farm when they needed a place to rest and resupply. Klaus Weber was different from many of the previous victims in several crucial ways. First, he was literate and kept a detailed journal of his family's journey to America, recording names, dates, and locations with the precision of someone who understood the importance of documentation. Second, he had served briefly in the Prussian army and had developed the soldier's habit of careful observation and attention to detail. Most importantly, he was naturally suspicious and cautious, traits that had been reinforced by difficult experiences during his journey from Germany. When the Weber family arrived at the Grayson farm on the evening of August 23rd, they were greeted with the same warm hospitality that had lured so many families to their deaths. Ezekiel Grayson welcomed them in fluent German, offered them food and shelter for the night, and expressed genuine interest in their plans and their journey. He seemed particularly interested in learning about their financial resources and their intended destination, questions that Klaus answered vaguely, having learned to be cautious about revealing too much information to strangers. What Klaus Weber noticed immediately was the smell. Despite Grayson's efforts to mask it with lime and other chemicals, there was an underlying odor around the farm that Klaus recognized from his military service, the distinctive smell of decomposing human remains. The odor was faint but persistent, seeming to emanate from the direction of the large red barn that dominated the farmyard. During the evening meal, Klaus had also noticed several items around the farmhouse that troubled him. He saw children's clothing that was clearly European in style hanging on pegs near the kitchen door. He glimpsed women's jewelry scattered on a table in a back room, pieces that looked like the kind of family heirlooms that immigrant women treasured and would never willingly abandon. Most disturbing of all, he saw a small wooden cross that he recognized as distinctly Bavarian in design, identical to one that his own family had carried from Germany. Klaus's military training had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct was telling him that the Grayson farm was a place of danger. When Ezekiel offered to show the family to their sleeping quarters in the barn, Klaus politely declined, explaining that his pregnant wife needed the comfort of sleeping indoors. Grayson seemed momentarily taken back by this refusal, but quickly recovered and offered them space in the farmhouse itself. That night, Klaus Weber did not sleep. Instead, he lay awake listening to the sounds of the farm, his soldiers' training, keeping him alert to any sign of danger. What he heard confirmed his worst fears. From somewhere beneath the farmhouse came the sound of muffled voices, speaking in German and what sounded like Irish Gaelic. The voices were pleading, crying, and occasionally screaming in terror before being abruptly silenced. Around midnight, Klaus heard footsteps moving around the farmhouse, followed by the sound of the barn doors being opened. Through the small window of their room, he could see Ezekiel Grayson moving between the house and the barn, carrying what appeared to be bundles of clothing and personal belongings. The farmer's movements were quick and furtive, like someone trying to conceal evidence of wrongdoing. Klaus Weber made a decision that would save his family's life and ultimately expose one of the most horrific criminal enterprises in American history. Instead of waiting until morning, he quietly woke his wife and children and told them they were leaving immediately. Anna Weber, trusting her husband's judgment, gathered their belongings without question. The family slipped out of the farmhouse before dawn and made their way quickly down the road toward Lancaster. But Klaus Weber's military training had taught him something else: the importance of gathering intelligence about enemy operations. Instead of simply fleeing to safety, he concealed his family in a grove of trees about half a mile from the Grayson farm and returned alone to conduct surveillance. What he observed over the next several hours would provide law enforcement with the first concrete evidence of systematic murder. From his concealed position, Klaus watched as Ezekiel Grayson emerged from the farmhouse, carrying a large bundle wrapped in canvas. The farmer looked around carefully to ensure he was not being observed, then carried the bundle to the barn. A few minutes later, he emerged empty-handed and returned to the house. This process was repeated several times over the course of the morning, with Grayson moving bundles from the house to the barn, with the methodical efficiency of someone following a well-established routine. Around mid-morning, Klaus observed something that made his blood run cold. Grayson emerged from the barn leading a horse-drawn cart loaded with what appeared to be human bodies wrapped in canvas and rope. The bodies were clearly those of adults and children arranged in the cart like cordwood. Grayson drove the cart to a remote area of his property, where Klaus could see several mounds of recently disturbed earth that looked suspiciously like graves. Klaus V. Burr watched as Ezekiel Grayson unloaded the bodies and began digging new graves with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this task many times before. The farmer worked quickly and methodically, burying the bodies in shallow graves and covering them with lime before filling in the holes with dirt. When the work was completed, Grayson scattered leaves and debris over the grave sites to disguise their appearance. Having seen enough to confirm his worst suspicions, Klaus Weber returned to his family and immediately set out for Lancaster to report what he had witnessed to the authorities. His detailed account, supported by his written journal and his credible demeanor as a witness, finally provided law enforcement with the evidence they needed to investigate the Grayson farm seriously. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford, who had served Lancaster County for over 12 years, initially found Klaus Weber's account almost impossible to believe. The idea that Ezekiel Grayson, a respected member of the community known for his charitable work, could be involved in systematic murder seemed preposterous. However, Weber's detailed observations combined with his obvious sincerity and the supporting evidence in his journal convinced Crawford that the allegations deserved serious investigation. The sheriff's first step was to conduct a careful review of missing person reports and inquiries about immigrant families who had disappeared in the Lancaster County area. What he discovered was a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Over the past 10 years, there had been dozens of inquiries about immigrant families who had last been seen in the vicinity of the Grayson farm. The families had all shared similar characteristics. They were traveling alone. They carried significant amounts of money, and they had no established connections in the American community. Crawford also interviewed several of the community members who had previously expressed concerns about unusual aspects of the Grayson operation. Martha Zimmerman provided detailed records of Grayson's purchases, which showed a clear pattern of buying supplies that would be needed to maintain and dispose of large numbers of people. Dr. Edmund Hartwell described the suspicious medical consultations that had never involved actual patient examinations. Father Johannes Brennan provided his records of missing families, which correlated closely with the timeline of disappearances that Crawford was developing. The most damning evidence came from Postmaster William Harrison, who had kept careful records of the mail patterns associated with the Grayson farm. Harrison's records showed that over 200 letters had been delivered to immigrant families supposedly staying at the Grayson property, but fewer than a dozen letters had ever been sent from the farm to addresses in Europe. This one-way communication pattern was completely inconsistent with normal immigrant behavior and suggested that the families were either being prevented from communicating with their relatives or were no longer alive to do so. Armed with this mounting evidence, Sheriff Crawford obtained a warrant to search the Grayson property. However, he knew that a normal search might not be sufficient to uncover evidence that had been carefully concealed over many years. Instead, he decided to conduct a surprise raid with a large team of deputies and volunteers, hoping to catch Grayson in the act of concealing evidence or to discover victims who might still be alive. On the morning of September 15, 1845, Sheriff Crawford led a team of 8 deputies and 12 volunteers in a coordinated search of the Grayson homestead. The team was divided into groups that simultaneously searched the farmhouse, the barn, and the various outbuildings, while other members secured the perimeter to prevent Grayson from escaping or destroying evidence. Ezekiel Grayson's reaction to the arrival of law enforcement was immediate and telling. Instead of expressing surprise or indignation at the search, as an innocent man might have done, Grayson became visibly agitated and began making frantic efforts to prevent the searchers from entering certain areas of his property. He claimed that the barn contained dangerous chemicals that could harm the searchers, and he insisted that several outbuildings were structurally unsound and unsafe to enter. The first concrete evidence was discovered in the farmhouse basement, where deputies found a hidden room that had been concealed behind a false wall. The room contained dozens of personal belongings that clearly belonged to immigrant families. Clothing, jewelry, religious artifacts, family photographs, and documents written in German and Irish Gaelic. The items were sorted and organized as if they were inventory in a store with similar items grouped together, and everything carefully cataloged. Among the personal belongings, deputies found several items that would prove crucial to identifying specific victims. There were letters addressed to family members in Europe, documents showing the amounts of money that families had carried, and even identification papers that some immigrants had managed to obtain before leaving their home countries. These items provided concrete proof that multiple families had been at the Grayson farm and had left behind their most precious possessions. But the most horrific discovery was yet to come. When deputies finally gained access to the large red barn, despite Grayson's protests, they found a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The barn had been converted into a systematic killing facility, with areas designated for different aspects of Grayson's murderous operation. The main floor of the barn contained what appeared to be a dining area with several long wooden tables surrounded by benches. The tables were set with bowls, cups, and utensils as if prepared for a meal. But the scene was frozen in time, covered with dust and cobwebs, and the bowls contained the desiccated remains of food that had been left untouched for months or even years. Arranged around these tables in positions that suggested they had been seated for a meal when they died were the mummified remains of 22 complete immigrant families. The dry conditions in the barn, combined with chemicals that Grayson had used to preserve the bodies, had created a grotesque tableau of death that preserved the victims' final moments in horrifying detail. The families were still dressed in their traveling clothes, and many still clutched personal belongings or reached toward the food that had been placed before them. Children sat next to their parents, their small hands still holding wooden toys or pieces of bread. Women wore the jewelry and clothing they had brought from their homelands, while men still carried the tools and documents they had hoped would help them build new lives in America. The preservation of the scene was so complete that investigators could read the expressions of terror and confusion on the victims' faces. It was clear that the families had been gathered for what they believed would be a communal meal, only to be killed simultaneously by some method that had left no obvious signs of violence on their bodies. Further investigation revealed the method that Grayson had used to murder his victims. Hidden beneath the barn floor was an elaborate system of pipes and vents that could be used to introduce poisonous gases into the dining area. Grayson had apparently lured families into the barn for meals, then sealed the exits and introduced deadly gases that killed everyone present within minutes. The system was sophisticated and carefully planned, suggesting that Grayson had spent considerable time and effort perfecting his method of mass murder. The discovery of the mummified families was only the beginning of the horror that investigators would uncover at the Grayson homestead. As they expanded their search to other areas of the property, they found evidence of an operation that was far more extensive and systematic than anyone had imagined. The Grayson farm had been the site of one of the most prolific serial killing operations in American history, an enterprise that had claimed the lives of dozens of families over more than a decade. The systematic excavation of the Grayson property over the following weeks revealed the true scope of Ezekiel Grayson's murderous enterprise, exposing a level of calculated evil that shocked even the most experienced investigators. What had initially appeared to be the work of a single deranged individual was gradually revealed to be a sophisticated criminal operation that had been refined and perfected over more than a decade of systematic murder. The mummified families in the barn represented only the most recent victims of Grayson's operation. As investigators expanded their search to other areas of the property, they discovered evidence of dozens of additional murders that had been carefully concealed across the 340-acre farm. Using information from Klaus Weber's observations and following the patterns of disturbed earth that several witnesses had noticed over the years, search teams began the grim task of excavating what would prove to be over 60 separate burial sites. The graves were scattered across the property in a pattern that revealed Grayson's methodical approach to concealing evidence. Rather than using a single burial ground that might attract attention, he had distributed the graves across different areas of the farm, often incorporating them into legitimate farming activities. Some bodies were buried beneath areas that were later planted with crops, while others were concealed under livestock feeding areas or near the foundations of farm buildings. Dr. Heinrich Brenner, who had been brought in from Philadelphia to assist with the medical examination of the remains, would later describe the excavation as the most disturbing experience of his professional career. The level of organization was unprecedented, he testified. Each burial site showed evidence of careful planning and execution. The bodies had been treated with lime and other chemicals to accelerate decomposition and control odor. Personal belongings had been systematically removed and cataloged. Even in death, these families had been processed like inventory in a warehouse. The examination of the remains revealed crucial information about Grayson's methods and the timeline of his crimes. The earliest burials appeared to date back to 1834, confirming that the operation had been active for over 11 years. The victims included men, women, and children of all ages, with entire families buried together in mass graves that preserved their final moments of terror and confusion. Most disturbing was the evidence that many of the victims had been alive when they were buried. The contorted positions of the bodies, torn fingernails, and evidence of desperate struggle all suggested that some families had been drugged or poisoned to the point of unconsciousness, then buried while still breathing. The realization that dozens of innocent people had awakened to find themselves trapped underground, slowly suffocating in their own graves, added an additional layer of horror to an already unthinkable crime. The investigation also revealed the sophisticated methods that Grayson had developed for luring and controlling his victims. Hidden beneath the farmhouse was an elaborate basement complex that had been designed specifically for holding families prisoner before they were murdered. The basement contained multiple rooms connected by narrow passages with heavy doors that could be locked from the outside and ventilation systems that could be controlled to make the air barely breathable. The largest room in the basement complex appeared to have been used as a holding area where families were kept, while Grayson decided their fate. The walls were covered with scratches and messages carved by desperate prisoners, many written in German and Irish Gaelic. The messages told a heartbreaking story of families who had realized too late that they had fallen into a trap. People who had used their final hours to leave messages for loved ones they would never see again. One message carved deep into the stone wall in careful German script read, "To our beloved family in Bavaria, we came to America seeking a better life, but found only death. Remember us with love and do not follow us to this cursed land." The Hoffman family, September 1842. Another scratched hastily in Irish Gaelic simply said, "God forgive us for trusting the devil himself." The basement complex also contained what appeared to be Grayson's planning and record-keeping center. Hidden behind a false wall, investigators found detailed ledgers that documented every aspect of his criminal enterprise. The ledgers contained information about each family that had been murdered, their names, ages, countries of origin, the amounts of money they had carried, and detailed descriptions of their personal belongings. The financial records were particularly revealing, showing that Grayson's operation had been enormously profitable. Over 11 years, he had stolen more than $47,000 in cash from his victims, equivalent to well over $1 million in modern currency. The money had been carefully invested in legitimate businesses and land purchases, creating a financial empire that was built entirely on the systematic murder of innocent families. But the ledgers revealed something even more disturbing than the financial scope of the operation. Grayson had been keeping detailed notes about the effectiveness of different murder methods, the time required to dispose of bodies, and the best techniques for concealing evidence. The entries read like scientific research notes documenting experiments in mass murder with the cold precision of a laboratory researcher. One particularly chilling entry dated March 15, 1843 read, "The gas method continues to be most efficient for large families. Complete incapacitation within 4 to 6 minutes, death within 10-12 minutes, no visible trauma, minimal cleanup required. The children expire first, which reduces panic among adults. Recommend continuing this approach for future operations." The investigation also uncovered evidence that Grayson had not been working alone. Hidden correspondence revealed that he had been in contact with criminal associates in other states who were involved in similar operations. The letters written in a simple code that investigators eventually deciphered discussed merchandise, immigrant families, processing facilities, murder sites and disposal methods, burial techniques with the casual tone of legitimate business correspondence. One letter received from someone identified only as Morrison in Ohio discussed the establishment of a new processing center and requested advice about inventory management and quality control. Another letter sent to an address in Virginia provided detailed instructions for building gas chambers and recommended suppliers for the chemicals needed to preserve bodies and control odors. The correspondence revealed that Grayson's operation was part of a larger network of criminals who were systematically targeting immigrant families across multiple states. The network appeared to be highly organized with different individuals responsible for identifying victims, luring them to killing sites, and disposing of evidence. The criminals shared information about effective techniques and warned each other about law enforcement activities that might threaten their operations. Federal marshals were immediately contacted to coordinate investigations in other states where similar operations might be active. The letters provided specific addresses and names that led to raids on properties in Ohio, Virginia, and Maryland. These raids uncovered additional evidence of systematic murder, revealing that the immigrant community had been targeted by a criminal conspiracy that was far more extensive than anyone had imagined. The psychological profile that emerged of Ezekiel Grayson was that of a man who had gradually transformed from a legitimate farmer into one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Interviews with neighbors and associates revealed that the transformation had been gradual, beginning with financial difficulties that had led him to view immigrant families as sources of easy money rather than people deserving of help and compassion. Dr. Benjamin Rush, a prominent Philadelphia physician who specialized in mental disorders, was brought in to examine Grayson and provide insight into his psychological state. Dr. Rush's evaluation revealed a man who showed no remorse for his crimes and who continued to view his victims as objects rather than human beings. He speaks of the families he murdered with the same tone that a farmer might use to discuss livestock, Dr. Rush reported. There is no evidence of guilt, shame, or recognition that he has committed moral wrongs. He appears to view his actions as simply a form of business that happened to involve killing people. The examination also revealed that Grayson had developed elaborate justifications for his crimes. He claimed that the immigrant families were better off dead than struggling to survive in America, that he had provided them with quick and relatively painless deaths, rather than allowing them to suffer from poverty and discrimination. He insisted that his actions had been a form of mercy, preventing the families from experiencing the hardships that awaited them in their new country. Most disturbing was Grayson's apparent pride in the efficiency and organization of his operation. During questioning, he provided detailed explanations of his methods, describing the improvements he had made over the years and the techniques he had developed for maximizing profits while minimizing risks. He spoke about his crimes with the enthusiasm of an inventor discussing a successful business venture. The investigation also revealed the extent to which Grayson had manipulated the legitimate immigrant assistance community to support his criminal enterprise. He had cultivated relationships with church leaders, aid organizations, and government officials who had unknowingly helped him identify and access potential victims. The very people who were supposed to protect immigrant families had been turned into unwitting accomplices in their destruction. Father Johannes Brennan, who had recommended dozens of families to Grayson over the years, was devastated by the revelation that his trust had been exploited to facilitate mass murder. "I believed I was helping these families find safety and opportunity," he testified through tears. "Instead, I was sending them to their deaths. The guilt of this knowledge will haunt me for the rest of my life." The community's reaction to the full scope of the discoveries was one of complete shock and disbelief. Many residents had difficulty accepting that someone they had known and respected for years could be capable of such monstrous acts. Some initially insisted that there must be some mistake, that Grayson must have been framed, or that the evidence must have been planted by his enemies. But as more evidence emerged and the scope of the crimes became undeniable, the community was forced to confront the horrifying reality that they had been living next to one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. The revelation shattered their faith in appearances and forced them to question their ability to judge character and recognize evil when it was hiding in plain sight. The psychological impact on the community was profound and lasting. Many residents reported nightmares, anxiety, and a persistent fear that other trusted community members might be hiding similar secrets. The sense of safety and security that had characterized rural Lancaster County was permanently damaged, replaced by a weariness and suspicion that would persist for generations. The investigation also revealed the broader implications of Grayson's crimes for American society. The systematic targeting of immigrant families highlighted the vulnerability of people who were isolated from established communities and legal protections. The crimes demonstrated how prejudice and xenophobia could be exploited by criminals who viewed immigrants as easy targets rather than fellow human beings deserving of protection and respect. As the full horror of the Grayson operation became clear, investigators realized that they were dealing with crimes that were unprecedented in American history. The systematic nature of the murders, the sophisticated methods used to conceal evidence, and the extensive criminal network that had supported the operation represented a new form of organized crime that law enforcement was unprepared to handle. The case would ultimately lead to significant changes in federal law enforcement capabilities and immigrant protection policies. But for the investigators who had spent weeks excavating graves and examining the remains of dozens of innocent families, the immediate challenge was simply processing the scope of human evil they had uncovered and finding a way to bring some measure of justice to the victims who had died in such horrific circumstances. The legal proceedings that followed the discovery at the Grayson homestead would become a complex and closely watched criminal case. The sheer scope of the crimes, combined with the interstate nature of the criminal network and the unprecedented number of victims, created legal challenges that pushed the American justice system to its limits and established precedents that would influence criminal law for decades to come. Ezekiel Grayson's arrest had been surprisingly anticlimactic. When confronted with the overwhelming evidence of his crimes, he had offered no resistance and had even seemed relieved that his operation had finally been exposed. During his initial interrogation, he had provided detailed confessions that filled over 200 pages of court documents describing his methods, his motivations, and the evolution of his criminal enterprise with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing a business venture. The confessions revealed the full extent of Grayson's psychological transformation from a legitimate farmer into a systematic killer. He described how financial difficulties in the early 1830s had led him to view immigrant families as potential sources of income, rather than people deserving of help. The first murder, he claimed, had been almost accidental. A family had discovered evidence of his theft of their money and had threatened to report him to authorities. In a moment of panic, he had killed them to prevent exposure. But what had started as a desperate attempt to avoid prosecution had gradually evolved into a calculated business model. Grayson had realized that immigrant families were perfect victims. They were isolated, vulnerable, and unlikely to be missed immediately if they disappeared. Over time, he had developed increasingly sophisticated methods for luring families to his farm, controlling them once they arrived, and disposing of their bodies in ways that minimized the risk of discovery. The psychological evaluation conducted by Dr. Benjamin Rush revealed a man who had completely dehumanized his victims, viewing them as objects to be processed rather than human beings with rights and dignity. Grayson showed no remorse for his actions and continued to justify his crimes as a form of business that had simply involved killing people as a necessary component of profit generation. The trial itself began on November 15, 1845, in the Lancaster County Courthouse, with Judge William Pianton presiding. The case attracted national attention, with newspapers from across the country sending reporters to cover what was being called one of the most horrific criminal cases in American history. The courthouse was packed daily with spectators, many of whom had traveled hundreds of miles to witness the proceedings. The prosecution, led by District Attorney William Patterson, faced the challenge of presenting evidence of crimes that were almost too horrific for jurors to comprehend. The physical evidence was overwhelming. The mummified bodies, the detailed ledgers, the correspondence with criminal associates, and the elaborate killing apparatus that had been discovered in the barn. But Patterson knew that the sheer scope of the crimes might actually work against conviction if jurors found the evidence too disturbing to process rationally. The prosecution's strategy was to present the evidence systematically, building a comprehensive picture of Grayson's operation, while helping jurors understand the human cost of his crimes. Klaus V. Burr, whose courage and observational skills had led to the discovery, was the star witness, providing detailed testimony about what he had observed at the Grayson farm and explaining how his military training had helped him recognize the signs of danger. The testimony of community members who had unknowingly assisted Grayson's operation was particularly powerful. Father Johannes Brennan, Dr. Edmund Hartwell, and Martha Zimmerman all described how their trust had been exploited to facilitate mass murder. Their obvious guilt and anguish helped jurors understand how Grayson had been able to operate undetected for so long, using his reputation for charity to gain access to vulnerable families. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when prosecutors presented the personal belongings that had been recovered from Grayson's hidden room. Tables full of jewelry, clothing, photographs, and documents were displayed in the courtroom, each item representing a family that had been murdered. The visual impact was overwhelming, with several jurors visibly moved to tears as they contemplated the tangible evidence of so many lives lost. The defense, led by experienced attorney Jonathan Caldwell, faced an almost impossible task. The evidence against Grayson was so overwhelming, and the crimes so horrific that a traditional defense of innocence was unthinkable. Instead, Caldwell attempted an insanity strategy, arguing that no sane person could have committed crimes of such magnitude and systematization. The defense strategy relied heavily on the testimony of Dr. Rush, who had conducted extensive psychological evaluations of Grayson. Dr. Rush testified that while Grayson clearly understood the nature of his actions and could distinguish right from wrong, He exhibited a form of psychopathy that rendered him incapable of genuine empathy or remorse. The doctor argued that Grayson's ability to systematize and rationalize mass murder demonstrated a form of insanity that should mitigate his criminal responsibility. However, the insanity strategy was undermined by Grayson's own detailed confessions, which demonstrated careful planning, consideration of consequences, and deliberate efforts to avoid detection. The prosecutors argued that the sophistication of Grayson's operation and his ability to maintain a facade of respectability for over a decade proved that he was completely sane and fully responsible for his actions. The trial lasted 6 weeks with more than 100 witnesses called to testify. The evidence presented filled over 3,000 pages of court transcripts and included hundreds of physical exhibits. Media coverage was intense, with newspapers providing daily accounts of the proceedings and editorials debating the broader implications of the case for American society. The jury deliberation lasted only 4 hours. On December 23, 1845, Ezekiel Grayson was found guilty of 89 counts of first-degree murder, one for each identified victim. The verdict was met with applause in the packed courtroom, but many observers noted that the magnitude of the crimes made any celebration of justice feel hollow and unsatisfying. The sentencing phase of the trial provided an opportunity for victims' families to express their grief and for the community to begin processing the trauma it had experienced. Several people who had lost relatives to Grayson traveled from Europe to testify at the sentencing phase, providing moving testimony about the impact of their losses. Maria Hoffman, sister of one of the victims, traveled from Bavaria to speak in court. Through an interpreter, she described how her family had saved for years to send her brother and his family to America, how they had waited anxiously for letters that never came, and how the discovery of their fate had devastated their entire community in Germany. "We sent our loved ones to America believing they would find a better life," she testified. "Instead, they found a monster who saw them as nothing more than objects to be robbed and discarded." Judge Pettin, in his sentencing statement, described Grayson's crimes as an affront to the very idea of human civilization and a betrayal of the fundamental values upon which this nation was built. He sentenced Grayson to death by hanging, a sentence that was carried out on March 15, 1846, before a crowd of more than 5,000 people who gathered to witness justice being done. Grayson's last words, according to witnesses, were a confession that he had followed the devil's path and a plea for forgiveness from the children he had helped to torture. However, many observers noted that even in his final moments, he seemed more concerned with his own situation than with the suffering he had caused to his victims. The investigation of Grayson's associates in other states led to several additional arrests and convictions, though many members of the criminal network managed to escape justice by fleeing to territories where federal law enforcement was limited. The coordinated raids in Ohio, Virginia, and Maryland resulted in the discovery of additional evidence of systematic murder, confirming that Grayson's operation had been part of a much larger conspiracy. Henry Morrison, Grayson's associate in Ohio, was captured and tried in 1847. His operation had been smaller in scale than Grayson's, but had resulted in the deaths of at least 23 immigrant families over a 6-year period. Morrison was convicted and executed, but not before providing information that led to the identification of other network members. The impact of the Grayson case on American policy and law was profound and lasting. Congress passed the first federal legislation addressing human trafficking and interstate crimes, giving federal marshals expanded authority to investigate and prosecute cases that cross jurisdictional boundaries. The legislation also established new protocols for protecting immigrant communities and created oversight mechanisms for organizations claiming to provide assistance to newcomers. The case also led to significant reforms in child welfare and protection systems. Pennsylvania passed the first comprehensive child protection laws in American history, establishing government oversight of orphanages, and requiring background checks for anyone seeking to adopt or care for large numbers of children. Other states quickly followed with similar legislation, creating the foundation for modern child welfare systems. Perhaps most importantly, the case changed public awareness about the vulnerability of immigrants and the need for systematic protection. The romantic notion of the charitable individual caring for orphan children was replaced by a more realistic understanding of the need for institutional oversight and legal safeguards. The phrase "another Grayson case" entered common usage as a warning about the potential for abuse in situations involving vulnerable children. Dr. Heinrich Brenner, the physician who had unknowingly enabled the Grayson operation through his medical consultations, dedicated the rest of his career to child welfare. He established free clinics specifically for orphaned and abandoned children and became an advocate for reforms in medical practice that would prevent physicians from being manipulated by criminals. His later writings on medical ethics were heavily influenced by his experience with the Grayson case. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford, who had led the initial investigation, was promoted to federal marshal and spent the rest of his career pursuing similar cases. He became one of the first law enforcement officials to specialize in crimes against children, developing investigative techniques and procedures that would be used for decades. Crawford's detailed reports on the Grayson case became required reading for law enforcement officers across the country. The children's stories, as they emerged over the years, revealed the full scope of human resilience and the long-term effects of systematic abuse. Some, like Klaus V. Burr, who had exposed the crimes, were able to build relatively normal lives with proper support and care. Others struggled with mental illness, addiction, and other problems that stemmed from their traumatic experiences. A few never recovered at all, dying young from complications related to their years of imprisonment and abuse. The network's correspondence, which had been preserved as evidence, provided investigators with information that led to additional cases for years after the initial discovery. Letters found in the Grayson basement contained references to other operations, other victims, and other perpetrators. Some of these leads resulted in successful prosecutions, while others led to dead ends or situations where too much time had passed to gather sufficient evidence. One of the most haunting aspects of the case was the realization that the Grayson operation had been just one part of a much larger system of exploitation that had existed largely undetected for decades. The investigation revealed that similar networks had operated in other parts of the country, that children had been bought and sold like commodities throughout American history, and that the legal and social systems had been inadequate to protect the most vulnerable members of society. The case also highlighted the role of community responsibility in preventing such atrocities. The residents of Clearfield, who had lived for years next to one of the most horrific crime scenes in American history, struggled with guilt and self-examination. How had they failed to see what was happening? What signs had they missed or ignored? Could they have prevented the suffering if they had been more vigilant or suspicious? These questions led to broader discussions about the obligation of communities to watch out for their most vulnerable members. The Grayson case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of accepting explanations without investigation, of respecting privacy when that respect enabled abuse, and of assuming that respectable appearances guaranteed moral behavior. The legacy of the Grayson case extended far beyond the immediate legal and social reforms it inspired. The detailed documentation of the investigation, including the correspondence, financial records, and testimony, became an invaluable resource for understanding the history of crime and exploitation in America. Historians, criminologists, and social reformers would study the case for generations, using it to understand how systematic evil could flourish in apparently normal communities. In the end, the Grayson family's reign of terror was brought to an end. Not by sophisticated police work or advanced investigative techniques, but by the simple courage of ordinary people who refused to ignore obvious signs of trouble. William Hutchinson's decision to report what he had heard, Sheriff Crawford's willingness to take community concerns seriously, and Klaus V. Burr's determination to testify despite his trauma. These individual acts of moral courage were what ultimately exposed one of the most horrific criminal enterprises in American history. The barn where 22 immigrant families were found mummified has been sealed for over a century, but the echoes of their suffering continue to remind us of the importance of vigilance, courage, and compassion in protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The Grayson case stands as both a testament to human evil and a reminder of the power of individual conscience to overcome even the most entrenched systems of exploitation and abuse. If this story has given you chills, you understand why these dark chapters of American history must never be forgotten. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in places like the Grayson homestead intensifies our understanding of how evil can hide behind respectable facades. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what other secrets lie buried in America's past. This mystery shows us that evil often wears the mask of respectability, and that the most horrific crimes can be committed by those who appear most normal to their communities. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or are there still secrets buried in the Pennsylvania hills? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The darkness of American history has many more secrets to reveal, and we'll be here to uncover them all. See you in the next video. Rewrite in high engaging wording. The year is 1845. The place, the peaceful, rolling farmlands of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. But behind the picture-perfect barns and fertile fields, a secret is about to be unearthed. A secret so monstrous it will shatter the American dream and expose a predator hiding in plain sight. For over a decade, Ezekiel Grayson was known as a saint, a charitable man who opened his farm to desperate immigrant families fleeing famine and persecution. 22 families, 89 souls. They came to his door seeking shelter, work, and a new beginning. They vanished without a trace. The official report was sealed for 80 years because what investigators found was so horrifying. It broke seasoned men. This isn't just a crime story. This is the story of how evil built a fortress behind a facade of kindness, and how one man's courage finally tore the walls down. This channel explores the darkest corners of American history, stories most people are too afraid to confront. If you're still here, you're not like everyone else. You understand that some truths, no matter how disturbing, must be told. Hit that subscribe button and join our community of fearless truth seekers. Tell me in the comments, what state are you watching from? Are you brave enough to hear what really happened in your own backyard? The perfect facade. Pennsylvania, 1845. A land of promise for new arrivals from Ireland and Germany. Ezekiel Grayson's 340-acre farm was the embodiment of that promise, a thriving, prosperous homestead. He was a pillar of the community, a churchgoer, a donor, a man who spoke the immigrants' languages and knew their struggles. He didn't just welcome them. He was recommended by pastors and doctors. The very networks created to protect the vulnerable were unknowingly funneling them straight into his trap. The first cracks in the picture. But if you looked closely, the picture began to warp. The general store owner sold him massive, regular orders of children's clothes and women's shoes. For charity, he said. The doctor was called to treat sick immigrants, but was never once allowed to see a patient. A priest grew uneasy after 47 families he'd connected with Grayson simply stopped writing home. The mailman noticed a chilling pattern. Letters poured in from Europe to the farm, but almost none ever went back out. An Amish neighbor watched scavenger birds perpetually circling Grayson's land. Animals, he said, can smell death. The clues were there. scattered, ignored, because who would dare suspect the town's favorite philanthropist? The witness who refused to look away. The end began with one family who didn't follow the script. Klaus Weber, a former Prussian soldier, arrived with his pregnant wife and children. Grayson's famous hospitality felt wrong. That night, Klaus heard muffled screams beneath the floorboards. He saw furtive movements in the dark. His military instincts screamed, "Get out." But Klaus Weber didn't just run. He hid his family and went back. From the trees, he watched as Grayson, thinking he was alone, hauled a cart piled with canvas-wrapped bundles to a remote field. The bundles were the wrong shape. The sizes were all too familiar. Klaus didn't see stolen goods. He saw families. His detailed, relentless testimony finally gave the sheriff the proof he needed to raid the Grayson farm. The barn of horrors. What they found in the big red barn froze the blood of every man present. It wasn't a barn. It was a preserved slaughterhouse. Seated at long tables as if for a final meal were the mummified remains of 22 families. Dust settled on bowls of uneaten food. Children still clutched toys. Their faces, preserved by the dry air and chemicals, were etched with pure terror. Beneath the floorboards, an intricate system of pipes to pump poisonous gas into the sealed room. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was systematic factory-line murder. The true scale of the nightmare. The barn was just the beginning. As they excavated the property, they uncovered over 60 graves scattered across the 340 acres. The earliest victims dated back to 1834. Ledgers detailed every murder with cold, businesslike precision, including the stolen wealth that built Grayson's fortune. But the most chilling find was in the farmhouse basement, a hidden prison. On the walls, desperate final messages were scratched in German and Gaelic. "To our family in Bavaria, we found only death. Do not follow us to this cursed land." The investigation exploded. Correspondence revealed Grayson wasn't a lone monster. He was part of a multi-state network trafficking in immigrant lives, sharing best practices for murder and disposal like businessmen comparing notes. The unmasking of a monster. At trial, the scale of the horror was laid bare. Grayson showed no remorse, calmly describing his methods as if discussing crop rotation. The defense claimed insanity. The prosecution proved cold, calculated greed. He was found guilty of 89 counts of murder and hanged in 1846, but his legacy was a scar on the nation's soul. This case ripped away the blindfold. It led to the first federal laws against human trafficking, reformed child welfare, and forced America to confront a devastating truth. The most vile evil often wears the kindest smile. This story proves the darkest secrets are buried in the places we're told to trust. If this tale of hidden horror gripped you, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Did we uncover everything? Or are there more secrets buried in the Pennsylvania hills? Let me know what you think in the comments. If you have the courage to keep uncovering history's darkest chapters, hit subscribe and ring the notification bell. We're just getting started. See you in the next video.